What if I told you that the house you're living in right now has secrets buried in its walls? What if the previous owners left behind more than just memories? Tonight, I'm sharing 11 absolutely terrifying true stories that will make you question everything you thought you knew about moving into a new home. These aren't urban legends or campfire tales. These are real experiences from real families who thought they were starting fresh, only to discover that some houses come with tenants who never moved out. From the couple who found someone living in their basement for months without their knowledge, to the family whose baby monitor picked up voices from a child who died in their nursery decades ago. These stories will crawl under your skin and stay there. You'll hear about the helpful neighbor who knew too much, the realtor who had been dead for 3 years, and the house that literally followed a family to their new home. Each story gets progressively more disturbing, building to revelations that will leave you checking every corner of your house tonight. If you've ever felt like you weren't alone in your new home, if you've heard unexplained sounds or found items that weren't yours, you need to hear these stories. Because sometimes, the American dream of home ownership becomes an absolute nightmare. And what you don't know about your house's history can destroy your life. These families learned the hard way that some doors should never be opened, some basements should never be explored, and some houses should never be bought. Are you ready to discover what might be hiding in your walls? Let's move to our first story, and I have to warn you, this one will make you question every sound you hear in your house tonight. This is the story of Emma and Mike Chen, a young couple from Portland, Oregon, who thought they had found their dream home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. What they discovered would turn their American dream into a living nightmare that still haunts them today. Emma and Mike had been saving for years to buy their first home. After months of house hunting, they finally found what seemed like the perfect place. A charming 2-story colonial built in 1987, complete with a finished basement, spacious kitchen, and a backyard, perfect for the family they hoped to start. The previous owners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, had lived there for over 30 years before moving to a retirement community. The house had been on the market for only 2 weeks when Emma and Mike made their offer, and it was accepted immediately. Everything seemed too good to be true, and as they would soon discover, it was. The first few weeks in their new home were blissful. Emma loved cooking in the spacious kitchen, and Mike enjoyed working on his woodworking projects in the basement workshop that came with the house. They spent their evenings painting rooms, hanging pictures, and making the space truly their own. But by the 3rd week, small things began to go missing. At first, it was just minor items. A coffee mug here, a book there, some leftover pizza that Emma was sure she had put in the refrigerator. Mike joked that they were dealing with friendly house ghosts, and Emma laughed it off, blaming her own forgetfulness as she adjusted to the new space. But the missing items became more frequent and more personal. Emma's favorite sweater disappeared from the bedroom. Mike's expensive drill vanished from the basement workshop. A bottle of wine they had been saving for their anniversary was gone from the kitchen counter. When Emma's grandmother's antique jewelry box went missing from their dresser, she knew something was seriously wrong. This wasn't forgetfulness. Someone was taking their belongings. The couple installed a basic security system and changed all the locks, thinking perhaps the previous owners had given spare keys to neighbors or family members. For a few days, nothing went missing, and they began to relax. But then the sound started. It began with subtle creaking at night, which they initially attributed to the house settling. Old houses make noise, they told themselves. But the sounds had a pattern. Footsteps that seemed to move through the house in the early morning hours, usually around 3 or 4 a.m. Emma was the first to hear them clearly. She woke up one Tuesday night to the distinct sound of someone walking across the kitchen floor above their bedroom. The footsteps were deliberate and careful, as if someone was trying to move quietly but couldn't avoid the creaky floorboards. She nudged Mike awake, but by the time he was fully conscious, the sounds had stopped. They crept upstairs together, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. Nothing. The doors were still locked, the windows secure, the alarm system armed and functioning. This pattern continued for weeks. The mysterious footsteps, always in the early morning hours, always stopping just as Mike and Emma would wake up fully. They began taking turns, staying awake, trying to catch whoever was in their house. Mike installed motion sensor cameras in the main living areas. But somehow, the intruder seemed to know exactly where the cameras were positioned and managed to avoid them completely. The breakthrough came when Emma decided to install a small, hidden camera in the kitchen pantry, a spot that seemed illogical, but had a clear view of the kitchen and part of the living room. She didn't tell Mike about this camera, wanting to surprise him if she actually caught something. 3 days later, she got more than she bargained for. The footage was terrifying. At 3:17 a.m., a tall, thin man emerged from what appeared to be the basement door. But Emma knew that door led to the basement. She and Mike had been down there countless times. The man moved through their kitchen with disturbing familiarity, opening cabinets, taking food, and even sitting at their kitchen table to eat. He knew exactly where everything was. He moved like someone who had been living in the house for years. Emma watched in horror as the man opened their refrigerator, took out ingredients, and made himself a sandwich using their food, their plates, their utensils. He cleaned up after himself meticulously, washing the dishes and putting everything back exactly where it belonged. Then, just as casually as he had appeared, he walked back to the basement door and vanished. Emma immediately woke Mike and showed him the footage. They called the police, but the officers who responded were skeptical. The basement had been thoroughly inspected during the home inspection, and there was no evidence of anyone living down there. The police did a cursory search, but found nothing unusual. They suggested the couple might be dealing with a very sophisticated break-in artist and recommended upgrading their security system. But Emma and Mike knew this was something more. The man in the footage wasn't breaking in. He was living there. The next day, they decided to conduct their own investigation of the basement. They had been down there dozens of times, but this time they looked more carefully. Mike noticed that one section of the basement wall looked slightly different from the rest. The paneling was the same, but there were small scuff marks near the floor, as if something had been moved repeatedly. After careful examination, they discovered that an entire section of the basement wall was actually a hidden door. It was so well constructed and perfectly fitted that it was virtually invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Behind this hidden door was a small but fully functional living space. Someone had been living in their house for months, or possibly years. The hidden room was about 8 feet by 12 feet, with a small cot, a camping stove, shelves lined with canned goods and bottled water, and dozens of personal items that Emma and Mike recognized as things that had gone missing from their house. There were Emma's sweater, Mike's drill, the jewelry box, and countless other belongings they had assumed were lost or misplaced. But most disturbing of all were the journals. The journals detailed everything about Emma and Mike's daily routines. What time they left for work, what time they came home, what they ate for dinner, what TV shows they watched when they went to bed. The entries went back months, starting even before Emma and Mike had moved in. Someone had been watching them, studying them, learning their patterns with obsessive detail. The final entry in the most recent journal was dated just 2 days earlier. It read, "They're getting suspicious. The cameras are making it harder to move around. May need to relocate soon. We'll miss this setup. They're much cleaner than the previous tenants." Emma and Mike called the police again, and this time with concrete evidence. The officers took the situation seriously. The hidden room was processed as a crime scene, and the journals were taken as evidence. DNA testing revealed that the intruder was Robert Henderson Jr., the 34-year-old son of the previous owners. He'd been living in the hidden room his parents had constructed years earlier, initially as a panic room during a period of neighborhood break-ins. When the elder Hendersons moved to the retirement community, they had forgotten to mention the hidden room to the real estate agent, and Robert had simply stayed. He had been living there for over 8 months, surviving on food he stole from Emma and Mike, and before them, from his own parents, who had attributed missing items to their aging memories. Robert was arrested 3 days later at a local library, where he had been spending his days using the internet and staying warm. He was charged with breaking and entering, theft, and stalking. During his interrogation, he revealed that he had been living in various hidden spaces in houses around the neighborhood for years, moving from one property to another when residents became suspicious or when houses were sold. Emma and Mike moved out of the house immediately and never returned. The house was eventually sold again, but not before the hidden room was permanently sealed. The new owners were fully informed about the property's history, and additional security measures were installed throughout the house. To this day, Emma says she can't sleep soundly in any house. Every creak, every unexplained sound, every missing item brings back the memory of those months when they unknowingly shared their home with a stranger who watched their every move. Mike still checks every room before going to bed, and both of them have developed an obsession with home security that their friends find excessive, but they consider absolutely necessary. The most chilling part of their story isn't just that someone was living in their house. It's how long it took them to realize it, and how easily it could happen to anyone. Robert Henderson Jr. had perfected the art of invisible cohabitation, and Emma and Mike's house wasn't his first. According to police investigations, he had been doing this for over a decade, and there may be other victims who still don't know they're sharing their homes with an unwanted tenant. Let's move to our second story. And this one will make you think twice about any home renovation project you might be planning. This is the story of the Martinez family from Austin, Texas, who discovered that some rooms in a house are sealed off for very good reasons. What they found behind a basement wall would force them to abandon their dream home and leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the previous owners. David and Lisa Martinez had been married for 12 years when they finally decided to buy their first house together. They had been renting apartments throughout their marriage, saving every penny for the perfect family home where they could raise their 2 young children, 8-year-old Sophia and 6-year-old Carlos. After months of searching, they found a beautiful 1960s ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood with excellent schools. The house had been owned by an elderly man named Walter Grimm, who had lived there alone for over 40 years after his wife passed away. When Walter died, his estate put the house on the market, and the Martinez family jumped at the opportunity. The house was perfect in almost every way, except for one thing. The basement was only partially finished. Half of it had been converted into a recreation room with wood paneling and carpeting, while the other half remained unfinished concrete walls and exposed ceiling beams. David, who worked in construction, saw this as an opportunity to add value to their home and create additional living space for their growing family. He planned to finish the basement himself, creating a home office and a playroom for the kids. 3 weeks after moving in, David began the basement renovation project. He started by taking measurements and planning the layout. But when he examined the unfinished section more carefully, he noticed something odd. The basement seemed smaller than it should be, given the footprint of the house above. According to his calculations, there should be at least another 8 feet of space beyond the far wall. He assumed there might be utility access or storage space that he hadn't accounted for. But when he checked the original house plans from the city records, the discrepancy became even more puzzling. The original blueprints showed the basement extending the full length of the house, but the current wall clearly cut off a significant portion of that space. David mentioned this to Lisa, and they both agreed that the previous owner must have walled off part of the basement for some reason. Perhaps there had been water damage, or maybe Walter had simply wanted to reduce the space he needed to maintain. Whatever the reason, David decided to investigate further before proceeding with his renovation plans. On a Saturday morning, while Lisa took the kids to soccer practice, David began carefully examining the wall that seemed to block off the missing basement space. The wall was constructed differently from the rest of the basement. It was newer, with different materials and a slightly different style of construction. Most tellingly, it didn't extend all the way to the ceiling. There was a small gap at the top, just wide enough for David to shine a flashlight through. What he saw in that flashlight beam made his blood run cold. The space beyond the wall wasn't empty storage or utility access. It was a fully furnished room. David could see what appeared to be furniture, decorations, and personal belongings arranged as if someone had been living there. But the air that came through the gap smelled stale and wrong, with an underlying odor that David couldn't identify, but that made his stomach turn. David immediately called Lisa and asked her to come home without the kids. When she arrived, he showed her what he had discovered. Lisa was initially skeptical. Maybe Walter had just walled off a room he didn't want to maintain, and the smell was just from years of being sealed up. But David's construction experience told him something was very wrong. The wall had been built hastily, without proper permits or professional construction standards. It was designed to hide something, not to create storage space. Against Lisa's better judgment, David decided to create a small opening in the wall to get a better look at what was hidden behind it. Using a reciprocating saw, he carefully cut a hole just large enough to crawl through. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, mold, and something else that neither of them could identify, but that made them both feel nauseous. David crawled through the opening with a powerful flashlight and immediately wished he hadn't. The hidden room was a nightmare, frozen in time. It was set up as a child's bedroom, complete with a small bed, toys, stuffed animals, and children's clothes. But everything was covered in a thick layer of dust and mold, and the toys and furniture were arranged in a way that seemed deliberately disturbing. The stuffed animals were positioned as if they were watching the bed, and children's drawings covered the walls. But the drawings depicted scenes of violence and terror that no child should ever imagine. But the most horrifying discovery was yet to come. In the corner of the room, David found a small wooden chest filled with photographs. The photos showed children, dozens of different children of various ages. But they weren't normal family photos. These were surveillance photos, taken from a distance, showing children playing in yards, walking to school, and going about their daily activities. Each photo was labeled with a name, an address, and detailed notes about the child's routine and habits. David immediately backed out of the room and called the police. When the officers arrived and saw what David had discovered, they immediately called for backup and contacted the FBI. The hidden room was processed as a crime scene, and the investigation that followed revealed a horrifying truth about Walter Grimm that no one in the neighborhood had ever suspected. Walter Grimm had been involved in illegal surveillance activities in the neighborhood. The hidden room contained evidence of his obsessive behavior and criminal planning, though investigators found no evidence he had acted on his plans. The discovery revealed a disturbing pattern of boundary violations that had gone undetected for years. The investigation revealed that Walter had constructed the hidden room in the early 1980s, shortly after his wife's death. Neighbors who were interviewed remembered that Walter had done extensive basement work around that time, claiming he was creating a workshop. In reality, he had been building his secret chamber. The room had remained hidden for over 40 years, with Walter accessing it through a concealed entrance in his bedroom closet that investigators discovered during their search. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the realization that many of the children in the photographs were now adults living in the same neighborhood. Some were parents themselves, completely unaware that they had been stalked and photographed as children. The FBI had to conduct sensitive interviews with dozens of former victims, many of whom were traumatized to learn that their childhood sense of safety had been an illusion. The Martinez family was devastated. Their dream home had become a crime scene, and they couldn't bear the thought of their own children living in a house where such evil had been planned and nurtured. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Sophia and Carlos began having nightmares, and Lisa developed severe anxiety about their safety. David blamed himself for making the discovery, even though he knew he had done the right thing by calling the police. The family moved out within a week of the discovery, staying with Lisa's parents while they tried to figure out their next steps. The house became the center of a major FBI investigation, and the story made national news. Property values in the entire neighborhood plummeted as parents worried about what other secrets might be hidden in their homes. The legal situation was complicated. The Martinez family had purchased the house in good faith, but they now owned a property that was worthless due to its horrific history. The estate of Walter Grimm had no assets to compensate them, and their insurance didn't cover losses due to criminal activity by previous owners. They were forced to sell the house at a massive loss to a company that specialized in properties with dark histories. The house was eventually demolished, and the lot remains empty to this day. The city refused to allow new construction on the site, and it has become an unofficial memorial to the children who were victimized by Walter Grimm's stalking. The Martinez family eventually recovered financially, but the psychological scars remain. David never worked on another basement renovation, and Lisa still has nightmares about what other secrets might be hidden in the walls of houses around the country. The FBI investigation into Walter Grimm's activities led to the discovery of similar hidden rooms in 2 other houses he had owned earlier in his life. In each case, the rooms contained evidence of his obsession with stalking children, though no evidence of physical crimes was ever found. The case became a landmark study in how predators can hide in plain sight for decades, and it led to new protocols for investigating properties with unusual construction or renovation histories. The most chilling aspect of the Martinez family story is how easily it could happen to anyone. Walter Grimm had been a respected member of the community, known for keeping his property immaculate and being a quiet, polite neighbor. No one suspected that behind his basement wall, he had been nurturing decades of criminal obsession. The Martinez family's renovation project had accidentally uncovered one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Austin's history, and their dream of creating a perfect family home had become a nightmare that would haunt them forever. Today, the Martinez family lives in a new house in a different city, but they still struggle with the knowledge that evil can hide behind any wall, in any basement, in any house that seems too perfect to be true. Their story serves as a reminder that when we buy a house, we're not just buying a building. We're inheriting its entire history, including the secrets that previous owners tried to bury forever. Let's move to our third story, and I need to warn you. This one involves something that could be happening in your neighborhood right now, and you might not even realize it. This is the story of Jennifer and Mark Thompson from Riverside, California, who thought they had found the perfect neighbor in their new subdivision. What they discovered about their helpful elderly neighbor would shatter their sense of security and reveal a deception that had been going on for decades. Jennifer and Mark Thompson were both in their early 30s when they decided to leave their cramped apartment in Los Angeles and move to the suburbs. They wanted a quiet, family-friendly neighborhood where they could start fresh and eventually raise children. After months of searching, they found a beautiful new construction home in a planned community called Meadowbrook Estates. The house was everything they had dreamed of. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a 2-car garage, and a backyard perfect for barbecues and future children's birthday parties. What made the house even more appealing was their neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a charming 72-year-old widow who lived in the house directly next door. From the moment Jennifer and Mark moved in, Mrs. Whitman was incredibly helpful and welcoming. She brought them homemade cookies on their first day, offered to collect their mail when they traveled, and seemed to know everything about the neighborhood's history and the best local services. She recommended the best grocery stores, the most reliable handymen, and even helped Jennifer find a new hairdresser. Mrs. Whitman appeared to be the perfect neighbor, friendly but not intrusive, helpful but respectful of boundaries. She kept her property immaculate, never played loud music, and always had a warm smile and a kind word. Jennifer and Mark felt incredibly lucky to have such a wonderful neighbor, especially after hearing horror stories from friends about difficult neighbors in other areas. But after living in their new home for about 6 weeks, Jennifer began to notice some odd things about Mrs. Whitman's helpfulness. The elderly woman seemed to know an unusual amount about their daily routines and personal habits. She would mention things like knowing when Jennifer had gotten home from work the previous day, or commenting on the groceries Mark had brought home, even though she hadn't been outside when these things happened. At first, Jennifer attributed this to Mrs. Whitman simply being observant and spending a lot of time looking out her windows, as many elderly people do. The first real red flag came when Mrs. Whitman mentioned that she had noticed Jennifer had been having trouble sleeping lately. Jennifer was startled because she hadn't mentioned her insomnia to anyone, and she had been very careful to keep her bedroom curtains closed. When she asked Mrs. Whitman how she knew about her sleep problems, the elderly woman laughed it off, saying she had noticed Jennifer's bedroom light on at odd hours and had heard her moving around the house at night. This explanation made Jennifer uncomfortable, but she tried to dismiss her concerns. However, over the next few weeks, Mrs. Whitman's comments became increasingly specific and personal. She knew what Jennifer and Mark had eaten for dinner, what TV shows they watched, and even details about their private conversations. When Jennifer mentioned this to Mark, he initially defended Mrs. Whitman, saying that sound traveled easily between houses and that older people often had excellent hearing, The situation escalated when Mrs. Whitman began offering unsolicited advice about Jennifer and Mark's relationship. She would make comments about arguments they had had in private, suggest solutions to problems they had never discussed with anyone, and even offer opinions about their future family planning decisions. Jennifer became increasingly paranoid, wondering if somehow Mrs. Whitman was listening to their conversations through the walls or if their house had some kind of acoustic problem that allowed sound to travel between properties. The breakthrough came when Jennifer decided to test her suspicions. She and Mark staged a fake argument in their living room, deliberately discussing a fabricated problem about Mark's fictional gambling addiction. They spoke in normal voices, as they would during any private conversation, and then waited to see if Mrs. Whitman would mention anything about it. 2 days later, Mrs. Whitman approached Jennifer while she was getting her mail and gently asked if everything was okay at home. She mentioned that she had been concerned about Jennifer and Mark, and that if Jennifer ever needed someone to talk to about Mark's problem, she was always available to listen. Jennifer was shocked. There was no way Mrs. Whitman could have overheard their conversation through normal means. That evening, Jennifer and Mark conducted a thorough search of their house, looking for any possible way that Mrs. Whitman could be monitoring their conversations. They checked for hidden cameras, listening devices, or any unusual wiring that might have been installed during construction. They found nothing obvious. But Mark, who worked in IT security, suggested they bring in a professional to sweep the house for surveillance equipment. The professional security consultant they hired found something that chilled them to the bone. Their house was riddled with sophisticated listening devices, tiny, nearly invisible microphones that had been installed in virtually every room. The devices were professional-grade equipment, far beyond what a typical homeowner would have access to. Even more disturbing, the consultant found that the devices were transmitting to a receiver located in Mrs. Whitman's house. Jennifer and Mark immediately called the police, but the investigation that followed revealed something far more sinister than they had imagined. Mrs. Whitman wasn't just spying on them. She had been doing this for years, in multiple houses, across several different states. Her real name wasn't Eleanor Whitman, and she wasn't a harmless elderly widow. She was actually Eleanor Vance, a 68-year-old woman with a long history of identity theft, fraud, and stalking. The police investigation revealed that Eleanor had developed an elaborate scheme over the past 15 years. She would research new housing developments and purchase homes in family-friendly neighborhoods, specifically targeting houses next to properties that would likely be purchased by young, affluent couples. She would then create a false identity as a friendly elderly widow and begin the process of infiltrating her neighbors' lives. Eleanor's method was sophisticated and patient. She would spend months building trust with her neighbors, establishing herself as a helpful, harmless, elderly woman. During this time, she would install listening devices in their homes, usually during times when she had legitimate access, bringing over food, helping with packages, or offering to let in repair workers when the homeowners were at work. She had developed relationships with corrupt contractors and service workers who would install the surveillance equipment in exchange for payment. Once Eleanor had access to her neighbors' private conversations, she would use the information for multiple criminal purposes. She would learn about their financial situations, their work schedules, their personal relationships, and their future plans. She used this information to commit identity theft, credit card fraud, and even burglary. She would wait until she knew her neighbors would be away for extended periods, then rob their homes of valuable items that she knew they owned based on their private conversations. But Eleanor's crimes went beyond financial fraud. She also used the intimate information she gathered to manipulate and control her neighbors' lives. She would create problems in their relationships by anonymously sharing private information, cause professional difficulties by revealing confidential work conversations, and even sabotage their social relationships by spreading rumors based on things she had overheard. The investigation into Eleanor's activities revealed that Jennifer and Mark were her seventh set of victims. Over the years, she had destroyed the lives of dozens of people, causing divorces, job losses, financial ruin, and severe psychological trauma. She had been so successful at maintaining her cover that none of her previous victims had ever suspected her involvement in their misfortunes. Eleanor had been particularly careful to target people who were unlikely to suspect an elderly neighbor of sophisticated criminal activity. She preyed on people's natural tendency to trust and help older adults. And she exploited the social expectation that neighbors should be friendly and supportive. Her victims had welcomed her into their lives, never imagining that their kindness was being used against them. The most disturbing aspect of Eleanor's crimes was how she had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement for so long. She would typically spend 2 to 3 years in each location, long enough to thoroughly exploit her victims, but not so long that patterns became obvious. When she sensed that suspicion might be growing, or when she had extracted maximum value from her current victims, she would simply disappear, selling her house and moving to a new state with a new identity. Jennifer and Mark's case was different because they had discovered Eleanor's surveillance relatively quickly before she had time to cause maximum damage. However, the psychological impact was still severe. They felt violated and betrayed, knowing that their most private moments had been monitored and recorded by someone they had trusted. They struggled with paranoia and anxiety, constantly wondering if they were being watched or if other neighbors might be involved in similar schemes. The legal proceedings against Eleanor were complicated by the fact that she had committed crimes in multiple states under different identities. Federal authorities eventually charged her with wire fraud, identity theft, stalking, and violation of privacy laws. She was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but the damage she had caused to her victims' lives was irreversible. Jennifer and Mark moved out of their house within 3 months of Eleanor's arrest. They couldn't bear to continue living in a place where their privacy had been so thoroughly violated. The house sat empty for over a year before they were finally able to sell it. And even then, they had to disclose the surveillance history to potential buyers, which significantly reduced the property's value. The Meadowbrook Estates neighborhood was forever changed by Eleanor's crimes. Property values plummeted as news of the surveillance scheme spread, and many residents moved away, unable to trust their neighbors or feel secure in their homes. The Homeowners Association implemented new security measures and background check requirements. But the sense of community that had once defined the neighborhood was permanently damaged. Today, Jennifer and Mark live in a different state, in a house they had professionally swept for surveillance devices before moving in. They still struggle with trust issues and have difficulty forming relationships with neighbors. Jennifer says she can never again enjoy the simple pleasure of having a helpful, friendly neighbor, without wondering what ulterior motives might be hidden behind the kindness. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that predators come in all forms, and that the people who seem most trustworthy and helpful might be the ones with the most to hide. Eleanor Vance had perfected the art of hiding in plain sight, using society's expectations about elderly women to mask her sophisticated criminal enterprise. For Jennifer and Mark, the lesson was clear. In a world where privacy is increasingly rare, the greatest threats to our security might be living right next door, watching and listening to our every move. Let's move to our fourth story. And this one will make you question every sound you hear through your baby monitor, even if you don't have children. This is the story of Rachel and Tom Bradley from Nashville, Tennessee, who converted their spare bedroom into a nursery for the baby they were hoping to have. What they heard through their baby monitor would reveal a tragic secret about their house that the previous owners had tried desperately to forget. Rachel and Tom Bradley had been trying to start a family for 3 years when they decided to buy their first house together. They had been living in a small apartment that barely had room for the two of them, let alone a baby. So they knew they needed more space if their dream of parenthood was ever going to become reality. After months of searching, they found a charming 1950s bungalow in a quiet residential neighborhood that seemed perfect for raising children. The house had belonged to an elderly couple, Harold and Margaret Sinclair, who had lived there for over 50 years before Harold's death prompted Margaret to move in with her daughter. The house had been lovingly maintained and updated over the decades, with beautiful hardwood floors, a renovated kitchen, and 3 bedrooms that would provide plenty of space for a growing family. The master bedroom was spacious and comfortable. The second bedroom would make a perfect home office, and the third bedroom, which faced the backyard and had lovely morning light, would be ideal as a nursery. Rachel and Tom moved in during the spring, and Rachel immediately began planning the nursery. Even though they weren't pregnant yet, she wanted everything to be perfect for when their baby finally arrived. She spent weeks researching cribs, changing tables, and decorating themes. Tom painted the room a soft yellow that would work for either a boy or a girl. And Rachel carefully selected furniture and decorations that would create a warm, welcoming environment for their future child. The final touch was a state-of-the-art baby monitor system that Rachel had researched extensively. She wanted the best possible technology to ensure their baby's safety, so she invested in a high-end digital monitor with video capability, two-way audio, and smartphone connectivity. Even though they didn't have a baby yet, Rachel set up the monitor system to test it and make sure everything was working properly. She placed the camera unit in the nursery and kept the parent unit in their bedroom, occasionally checking the feed to ensure the system was functioning correctly. About 2 weeks after installing the monitor, Rachel began hearing strange sounds coming through the device at night. At first, she thought it might be interference from other electronic devices or perhaps neighbors' baby monitors picking up the same frequency. The sounds were faint and unclear, what seemed like soft crying or whimpering that would last for a few minutes and then stop. Rachel mentioned it to Tom, but he suggested it was probably just the monitor picking up sounds from outside or from other houses in the neighborhood. But the sounds became more frequent and more distinct. Rachel began hearing what sounded like a child crying, not the sharp, demanding cry of a newborn, but the softer, more heartbreaking sobs of a toddler. The crying always occurred between 2 and 4 in the morning, and it always seemed to be coming from inside the nursery itself, not from outside interference. Rachel would check the video feed, but the room always appeared empty, with no movement or disturbance visible on the camera. Tom remained skeptical, suggesting that Rachel might be experiencing some kind of psychological phenomenon related to their fertility struggles. He pointed out that she had been under a lot of stress about getting pregnant, and that sometimes people hear what they want to hear, or what they fear to hear. But Rachel knew what she was hearing was real, and she began recording the audio from the monitor to prove to Tom that she wasn't imagining things. The recordings were undeniable. The sound of a child crying was clear and distinct, and it was definitely coming from inside the nursery. But even more disturbing were the other sounds Rachel began to pick up. What sounded like a woman's voice, soft and soothing, as if someone was comforting the crying child. The voice was too faint to make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably that of a mother trying to calm her baby. Tom finally heard the sounds himself one night when he was having trouble sleeping. He was lying in bed around 3 in the morning when the familiar crying began. But this time, it was louder and more persistent than Rachel had described. Tom got up to check the video monitor, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The nursery appeared empty on the camera, but the audio was picking up not just crying, but what sounded like footsteps moving around the room and the creaking of the rocking chair they had placed in the corner. The next morning, Tom and Rachel decided to investigate the history of their house more thoroughly. They contacted the real estate agent who had sold them the property, but she claimed to know nothing about any previous tragedies or unusual occurrences. However, she did provide them with the contact information for Margaret Sinclair, the previous owner who was now living with her daughter. Rachel called Margaret initially just to ask about some minor house maintenance issues, but eventually worked up the courage to ask about the third bedroom. Margaret's reaction was immediate and emotional. There was a long silence on the phone, and then Margaret began to cry. She asked Rachel why she was asking about that room, and when Rachel explained about the baby monitor, Margaret's sobs became even more intense. Margaret agreed to meet with Rachel and Tom the following day, and what she told them explained everything they had been experiencing. 53 years earlier, when Margaret and Harold were young newlyweds, they had had a daughter named Emily. Emily had been the light of their lives, a beautiful, happy toddler who filled their home with laughter and joy. The third bedroom had been Emily's nursery, and Margaret had spent countless hours in that room, rocking her daughter to sleep and comforting her when she cried. When Emily was 18 months old, she had become ill with what seemed like a simple cold. But the illness had progressed rapidly, and despite Margaret's frantic efforts to care for her, Emily had died in her sleep one night in the nursery. Margaret had found her daughter's body the next morning, and the grief had nearly destroyed both her and Harold. After Emily's death, Margaret and Harold had sealed off the nursery and never used it again. They had been unable to have more children, and the room had remained empty for over 50 years, a shrine to the daughter they had lost. Margaret had never been able to bring herself to change anything in the room or to use it for any other purpose. When they had finally decided to sell the house, Margaret had insisted that the room be converted to a generic bedroom, with all traces of its history as a nursery removed. But Margaret revealed something else that chilled Rachel and Tom to the bone. She told them that for years after Emily's death, she had continued to hear her daughter crying at night. She would wake up to the sound of Emily's voice calling for her, and she would rush to the nursery, only to find it empty. Harold had initially thought Margaret was having a breakdown from grief, but eventually he began hearing the sounds too. The phenomena had continued for decades, with both Margaret and Harold occasionally hearing Emily's cries and Margaret's own voice from 50 years ago comforting her dying daughter. They had learned to live with it, understanding that their grief and love for Emily had somehow imprinted itself on the room where she had spent her short life. Margaret explained that she had hoped the sounds would stop when she moved out, that perhaps Emily's spirit would finally be at peace. But hearing that Rachel and Tom were experiencing the same phenomena suggested that Emily was still there, still crying for her mother in the room where she had died over half a century ago. Rachel and Tom were devastated by this revelation. They had created a nursery in a room where a child had died, and they were now experiencing the echoes of a mother's grief from decades past. The irony was heartbreaking. They had been trying so hard to bring life into that room, not knowing that death had claimed it long ago. The psychological impact on Rachel was severe. She became obsessed with the idea that Emily's spirit was somehow preventing her from getting pregnant, that the room was cursed, or that she was being punished for disturbing Emily's resting place. She began having nightmares about finding a dead child in the nursery, and she developed severe anxiety about the possibility of having a baby only to lose it in the same room where Emily had died. Tom tried to be supportive, but he was also deeply affected by the revelation. He suggested they convert the room to a different purpose and try to create a nursery elsewhere in the house. But Rachel couldn't bear the thought of continuing to live in a house where such tragedy had occurred. She felt like they were intruding on Emily's memory, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they would never be able to have a happy family in a house haunted by such profound loss. The couple tried to continue living in the house for several more months, but the nightly crying continued, and Rachel's mental health deteriorated. She began seeing a therapist to deal with her grief and anxiety. But the therapist suggested that staying in the house might be preventing her from healing. The constant reminder of child loss was exacerbating her own fears about fertility and motherhood. Rachel and Tom eventually decided to sell the house and move somewhere with no tragic history. The decision was financially devastating. They had put their life savings into the house and the renovations, and they had to sell at a loss. But they felt they had no choice if they wanted to preserve their marriage and their mental health. Before they moved out, Rachel did something that surprised even herself. She contacted Margaret and asked if she could visit the house one more time. Margaret agreed, and the two women spent an afternoon in Emily's room together. Margaret told Rachel stories about Emily's short life, about the joy she had brought to the house, and about the love that had filled that room before tragedy struck. Rachel realized that the sounds they had been hearing weren't malevolent or threatening. They were simply the echoes of a mother's love, preserved in a room where that love had been most intense. Margaret had spent so many nights in that room, comforting Emily and singing to her, that those moments had somehow become part of the room's very essence. The two women said a prayer together for Emily, and Margaret finally felt ready to let go of the room that had held her grief for over 50 years. Rachel promised that if she and Tom ever had children, she would tell them about Emily and make sure her memory was honored. Rachel and Tom moved to a different city and eventually did have children, twin boys who are now healthy and happy. But Rachel never forgot about Emily or about the room where a mother's love had been so strong that it transcended death itself. She keeps a photo of Emily, given to her by Margaret, in her son's nursery. And she sometimes tells them the story of the little girl who lived in their old house long ago. The house where Emily died was eventually sold to a family who knew its history and chose to embrace it rather than fear it. They converted Emily's room into a library and placed a small memorial plaque on the wall, honoring the memory of the child who had filled that room with love over 50 years ago. The crying stopped after that, as if Emily's spirit had finally found the peace and recognition it had been seeking all along. Rachel's story reminds us that houses hold memories, both joyful and tragic, and that sometimes the sounds we hear in the night are not threats to be feared, but echoes of love that refuse to be forgotten. The baby monitor that was meant to protect future children had instead revealed the presence of a child from the past, whose brief life had left an indelible mark on the room where she had been loved so deeply. Let's move to our fifth story, and this one will make you reconsider every friendly gesture from your neighbors. This is the story of Amanda and Chris Peterson. from Phoenix, Arizona, who thought they had won the neighbor lottery when they moved next door to Betty Morrison, a sweet 67-year-old retired teacher who seemed to anticipate their every need. What they discovered about Betty's helpfulness would reveal a deception so elaborate and disturbing that it would change how they viewed trust forever. Amanda and Chris Peterson were both busy professionals in their late 20s when they decided to buy their first house together. Amanda worked as a marketing manager for a tech company, often putting in 12-hour days, while Chris was a traveling sales representative who was frequently away from home for days at a time. They knew they needed a house in a safe, quiet neighborhood where Amanda would feel secure when Chris was traveling, and where they could both relax after their demanding work schedules. They found the perfect house in Sunset Ridge, a well-established neighborhood with tree-lined streets and a strong sense of community. The house was a beautiful southwestern-style ranch with a red tile roof, stucco walls, and a desert landscape that required minimal maintenance, perfect for their busy lifestyle. But what made the house even more appealing was their next-door neighbor, Betty Morrison. Betty was everything Amanda and Chris could have hoped for in a neighbor. She was a retired elementary school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. She had raised 3 children in her house, all of whom had grown up and moved to other states, leaving Betty alone but actively involved in the community. She served on the Homeowners Association board, organized neighborhood watch meetings, and was known throughout Sunset Ridge as someone who looked out for everyone's welfare. From the moment Amanda and Chris moved in, Betty was incredibly helpful. She brought them a welcome basket filled with homemade cookies, local restaurant recommendations, and useful information about the neighborhood. She offered to collect their mail and packages when they traveled, volunteered to water their plants, and even gave them spare keys to her house in case they ever locked themselves out and needed to use her phone or wait for a locksmith. Betty seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate Amanda and Chris's needs. When Amanda mentioned that she was looking for a good dry cleaner, Betty had already researched the best options in the area and provided detailed reviews. When Chris needed a reliable mechanic for his car, Betty had a list of trustworthy shops with contact information and price comparisons. When Amanda was sick with the flu, Betty appeared at their door with homemade soup and offered to pick up prescriptions from the pharmacy. At first, Amanda and Chris felt incredibly lucky to have such a thoughtful, caring neighbor. Betty's helpfulness made their transition to homeownership much smoother, and they appreciated having someone reliable nearby, especially when Chris was traveling. Betty seemed to understand their schedules perfectly, always offering help at exactly the right moments and never being intrusive or demanding of their time. But after living in the house for about 3 months, Amanda began to notice that Betty's helpfulness was almost too perfect. Betty always seemed to know exactly when Amanda would be home from work, when Chris would be leaving for business trips, and when they would need specific types of assistance. She would appear at their door with solutions to problems they hadn't even mentioned to her. And she seemed to have detailed knowledge about their daily routines and personal preferences. The first real warning sign came when Betty mentioned that she had noticed Amanda had been working late every night that week and suggested that Amanda might want to consider asking her boss for a more reasonable schedule. Amanda was puzzled because she hadn't told Betty about her work schedule, and she was careful to park in her garage so that Betty wouldn't necessarily know when she came and went. When Amanda asked how Betty knew about her late nights, Betty laughed and said she had noticed Amanda's bedroom light on late and had heard her moving around the house. This explanation made Amanda uncomfortable, but she tried to dismiss her concerns. However, over the next few weeks, Betty's comments became increasingly specific and personal. She knew what groceries Amanda and Chris bought, what TV shows they watched, and even details about their phone conversations with family members. When Amanda mentioned this to Chris, he initially defended Betty, saying that she was probably just very observant, and that sound might travel between the houses more than they realized. The situation escalated when Betty began offering advice about Amanda and Chris's relationship and future plans. She would make comments about arguments they had had in private, suggest solutions to problems they had never discussed with anyone, and even offer opinions about their financial decisions and career choices. Betty seemed to know intimate details about their marriage, their family relationships, and their personal goals that they had never shared with anyone outside their immediate family. Amanda became increasingly paranoid, wondering if Betty was somehow listening to their conversations or if their house had some kind of acoustic problem that allowed sound to travel between properties. She began speaking more quietly when she was at home and started having sensitive conversations with Chris only when they were away from the house. The breakthrough came when Amanda decided to test her suspicions. She and Chris staged a fake conversation in their living room, deliberately discussing Amanda's fictional job offer in Seattle and their supposed plans to move there within the next month. They spoke in normal voices, as they would during any private conversation, and then waited to see if Betty would mention anything about it. 2 days later, Betty approached Amanda while she was getting her mail and expressed concern about hearing that Amanda and Chris might be moving to Seattle. She said she would be sad to see them go, but understood that career opportunities were important. She even offered to help them find a good real estate agent and suggested some neighborhoods in Seattle that might be suitable for young professionals. Amanda was shocked. There was no way Betty could have overheard their conversation through normal means. That evening, Amanda and Chris conducted a thorough search of their house, looking for any possible way that Betty could be monitoring their conversations. They checked for hidden cameras, listening devices, or any unusual wiring that might have been installed during construction or renovation. They found nothing obvious, but Chris, who had some experience with security systems through his sales work, suggested they bring in a professional to sweep the house for surveillance equipment. The professional security consultant they hired found something that made their blood run cold. Their house was filled with sophisticated listening devices, tiny, nearly invisible microphones that had been installed in virtually every room. The devices were professional-grade equipment, far beyond what a typical homeowner would have access to. Even more disturbing, the consultant found that the devices were transmitting to a receiver located in Betty's house. The installation was so sophisticated that it had clearly been done by someone with extensive technical knowledge and experience. Amanda and Chris immediately called the police, but the investigation that followed revealed something far more sinister than they had imagined. Betty Morrison wasn't just spying on them. She had been doing this for over a decade, systematically targeting young couples who moved into the neighborhood. Her real background wasn't as a retired elementary school teacher, but as a former intelligence analyst who had worked for a private security company before retiring. The police investigation revealed that Betty had developed an elaborate scheme over the past 12 years. She would identify houses in the neighborhood that were likely to be purchased by young, affluent couples, and she would use her position on the Homeowners Association board to gain access to properties during the sales process. She would install listening devices in houses before new owners moved in, usually during the final walkthrough or inspection period, when she could gain access as a helpful neighbor, offering to let in inspectors or contractors. Betty's method was sophisticated and patient. She would spend months building trust with her new neighbors, establishing herself as a helpful, caring community member. During this time, she would use the information gathered from the listening devices to create the illusion of being incredibly intuitive and helpful. She would learn about her neighbors' schedules, preferences, problems, and needs, Then use this information to appear at exactly the right moments, with exactly the right solutions. But Betty's surveillance wasn't just about being helpful. It was about control and manipulation. She used the intimate information she gathered to influence her neighbors' decisions, relationships, and life choices. She would create problems and then offer solutions, manipulate situations to make herself indispensable, and even sabotage relationships or opportunities that might cause her targets to move away from the neighborhood. The investigation revealed that Amanda and Chris were Betty's fifth set of victims. Over the years, she had systematically manipulated the lives of multiple couples, causing some to divorce, others to make poor financial decisions, and several to develop psychological problems related to the constant feeling of being watched and controlled. Betty had been so successful at maintaining her cover that none of her previous victims had ever suspected her involvement in their personal difficulties. Betty had been particularly careful to target people who were unlikely to suspect an elderly neighbor of sophisticated surveillance activities. She preyed on people's natural tendency to trust and appreciate helpful neighbors. And she exploited the social expectation that community members should look out for each other. Her victims had welcomed her into their lives, never imagining that their gratitude was being used against them. The most disturbing aspect of Betty's crimes was how she had managed to stay undetected for so long. She had carefully studied each couple's psychology and had tailored her manipulation to their specific vulnerabilities. She would identify relationship problems, career insecurities, or family issues, then use her helpful advice to exacerbate these problems while positioning herself as the solution. Amanda and Chris's case was different because they had discovered Betty's surveillance relatively quickly, before she had time to cause maximum psychological damage. However, the impact was still severe. They felt violated and betrayed, knowing that their most private moments had been monitored and manipulated by someone they had trusted and appreciated. The legal proceedings against Betty were complicated by the fact that many of her activities fell into gray areas of the law. While the surveillance was clearly illegal, much of her manipulation had been accomplished through seemingly helpful advice and community involvement. Federal authorities eventually charged her with wiretapping, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy. But many of her victims felt that the charges didn't adequately reflect the psychological damage she had caused. Betty was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. But the sentence felt inadequate to her victims, who had to live with the knowledge that their most intimate moments had been violated by someone they had considered a friend. The case became a landmark study in how predators can use positions of trust and community involvement to mask sophisticated criminal enterprises. Amanda and Chris moved out of their house within 2 months of Betty's arrest. They couldn't bear to continue living in a place where their privacy had been so thoroughly violated, and they struggled with trust issues that made it difficult to form relationships with new neighbors. The house sat empty for over 6 months before they were finally able to sell it, and even then, they had to disclose the surveillance history to potential buyers. The Sunset Ridge neighborhood was forever changed by Betty's crimes. Property values declined as news of the surveillance scheme spread, and many residents moved away, unable to trust their neighbors or feel secure in their homes. The Homeowners Association was dissolved and reformed with new leadership, but the sense of community that had once defined the neighborhood was permanently damaged. Today, Amanda and Chris live in a different state, in a house they had professionally swept for surveillance devices before moving in. They still struggle with trust issues and have difficulty accepting help from neighbors, no matter how genuine it might seem. Amanda says she can never again enjoy the simple pleasure of having a helpful, caring neighbor without wondering what ulterior motives might be hidden behind the kindness. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that predators can hide behind the most benevolent facades, and that the people who seem most helpful and trustworthy might be the ones with the most to hide. Betty Morrison had perfected the art of weaponizing kindness, using people's natural gratitude and trust to mask a sophisticated surveillance and manipulation operation that destroyed lives while appearing to improve them. For Amanda and Chris, the lesson was clear. In a world where privacy is increasingly rare, the greatest threats to our security and autonomy might be living right next door, hiding behind smiles and homemade cookies, watching and listening to our every move while pretending to care about our welfare. Let's move to our sixth story. And I need to warn you. This one involves something that could be lurking in your own basement right now, and you might never know it's there. This is the story of Kevin and Lisa Hartwell from Denver, Colorado, who thought the strange sounds coming from their basement were just the house settling. What they discovered living behind their furnace would force them to abandon their home and question everything they thought they knew about what can survive in the darkness beneath our feet. Kevin and Lisa Hartwell were both in their mid-30s when they decided to upgrade from their cramped downtown apartment to a house in the suburbs. They had been saving for years to afford a place with enough space for Kevin's home workshop and Lisa's art studio. And they finally found what seemed like the perfect property in Lakewood, a quiet residential area just outside Denver. The house was a 1970s split level with a large basement that would provide plenty of room for both of their hobbies. The house had been owned by an elderly man named Frank Delacroix, who had lived there alone for over 20 years after his wife passed away. Frank had been a bit of a recluse, according to the neighbors, rarely leaving his house except for essential errands and keeping to himself. When Frank died of natural causes at age 78, his estate put the house on the market, and Kevin and Lisa were able to purchase it at a reasonable price due to its dated interior and the fact that it had been empty for several months. The basement was exactly what Kevin and Lisa had been looking for. A large, partially finished space with concrete floors, exposed ceiling beams, and plenty of room for workshops and storage. The previous owner had used part of the basement as a workshop, and there were still workbenches, tool cabinets, and various pieces of equipment left behind. The furnace and water heater were located in a separate utility room at the far end of the basement, behind a door that Frank had kept locked. Kevin and Lisa moved in during the fall, and they immediately began setting up their respective workspaces in the basement. Kevin claimed the area near the stairs for his woodworking shop, while Lisa set up her art studio in the finished section with better lighting. They both loved having the extra space, and they spent most of their free time in the basement, working on their projects and enjoying the quiet, private atmosphere. But after living in the house for about 6 weeks, they began hearing strange sounds coming from the basement, particularly from the area around the furnace room. The sounds were subtle at first, soft scratching noises, occasional thumping, and what sounded like something moving around behind the walls. Kevin initially attributed the sounds to the heating system cycling on and off, or perhaps small animals like mice or squirrels that had gotten into the walls. However, the sounds became more frequent and more distinct as the weather got colder and they began using the furnace more regularly. Lisa began hearing what sounded like breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the utility room. When she mentioned this to Kevin, he suggested it might be the sound of the furnace's air intake system. But Lisa insisted that the breathing sounds occurred even when the furnace wasn't running. The situation escalated when they began finding muddy footprints in the basement that neither of them could explain. The prints appeared overnight, usually near the furnace room door, and they were clearly made by bare feet. long, narrow prints that were larger than either Kevin's or Lisa's feet. The prints would appear even when it hadn't rained, and they seemed to be made by someone who was walking very carefully, trying to avoid making noise. Kevin and Lisa initially thought someone might be breaking into their house through the basement, but they couldn't find any signs of forced entry. All the basement windows were secure, the door leading outside was locked from the inside, and there were no obvious ways for someone to get in. They installed motion sensor lights in the basement and began checking the space more frequently. But they never saw anyone, and the mysterious footprints continued to appear. The breakthrough came when Lisa decided to set up a small camera in the basement to try to catch whoever was making the footprints. She positioned the camera to have a clear view of the area around the furnace room, and she left it recording overnight. What she captured on video was so disturbing that she initially thought it must be some kind of technical malfunction or optical illusion. The footage showed a tall, unnaturally thin figure emerging from behind the furnace around 2:30 a.m. The figure moved in a strange, jerky manner, as if it wasn't accustomed to walking upright. It appeared to be human, but there was something fundamentally wrong with its proportions. Its limbs were too long, its torso too narrow, and its head seemed too small for its body. The figure moved around the basement for several minutes, examining Kevin and Lisa's belongings and even touching some of their tools and art supplies. Most disturbing of all, the figure seemed to be aware of the camera. At one point, it turned directly toward the lens, and Lisa could see what appeared to be a human face, but one that was gaunt and pale, with sunken eyes and an expression of intelligence that was somehow both human and completely alien. The figure stared at the camera for several long seconds, as if it was studying Lisa through the lens, before retreating back behind the furnace. Kevin was initially skeptical of the footage, suggesting it might be a hoax or some kind of digital artifact. But when they reviewed the video together, he couldn't deny what they were seeing. The figure was clearly real, and it was clearly living in their basement. They immediately called the police, but the officers who responded were baffled by the footage and unsure how to proceed. They searched the basement thoroughly, but found no evidence of an intruder or any way someone could be hiding in the space. However, one of the officers, a veteran named Detective Martinez, who had seen many unusual cases over his 20-year career, suggested they bring in a structural engineer to examine the basement more carefully. He had a feeling that there might be hidden spaces or access points that weren't immediately obvious. The engineer they hired found something that explained everything and made the situation even more terrifying. Behind the furnace, hidden by carefully positioned ductwork and insulation, was a narrow crawl space that extended under the entire house. The space was only about 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, but it was long enough for someone to move throughout the house's foundation. Even more disturbing, the crawl space showed clear signs of long-term habitation: makeshift bedding, stored food and water, and waste disposal areas that suggested someone had been living there for years. The engineer also discovered that the crawl space connected to the city's storm drain system through a damaged foundation wall. Someone could access the space from the storm drains and live under the house without ever being detected from above. The setup was so sophisticated that it had clearly been developed over a long period of time by someone with extensive knowledge of the house's structure. The police investigation that followed revealed the horrifying truth about what Kevin and Lisa had been sharing their home with. The figure in the video was identified as Marcus Delacroix, the 45-year-old son of the previous owner, Frank Delacroix. Marcus had been living in the crawl space under the house for over 15 years, surviving on food he stole from his father and later from Kevin and Lisa. Marcus had a severe mental illness that had gone untreated for decades. He had developed an extreme form of agoraphobia and social anxiety that made it impossible for him to function in normal society. When he was in his 20s, he had gradually retreated from the world, eventually creating the hidden living space under his father's house. Frank had known about Marcus's presence, but had been too ashamed and frightened to seek help, instead enabling his son's condition by leaving food and supplies where Marcus could access them. When Frank died, Marcus had simply continued living in the crawl space, adapting to the presence of new occupants above him. He had been surviving by stealing small amounts of food and supplies from Kevin and Lisa, and he had been watching them through gaps in the floorboards and heating vents. The breathing sounds Lisa had heard were real. Marcus had been listening to their conversations and observing their daily routines from just a few feet below their feet. The most disturbing aspect of the discovery was the realization that Marcus had been living so close to them for months without their knowledge. He had been underneath their bedroom while they slept, under their kitchen while they ate, and under their living room while they watched television. He had been an invisible presence in their lives, watching and listening to everything they did. Marcus was taken into custody and eventually committed to a psychiatric facility for treatment. The evaluation revealed that years of isolation and living in cramped, dark conditions had severely affected his physical and mental health. He had developed a condition called cave syndrome, where prolonged exposure to darkness and isolation had altered his sleep patterns, social behavior, and even his physical appearance. His pale, gaunt appearance and unusual movements were the result of years of living in a space where he could barely stand upright. Kevin and Lisa were traumatized by the discovery. They couldn't bear the thought of continuing to live in a house where someone had been watching them from below for months. The knowledge that Marcus had been underneath their bedroom, listening to their private conversations and intimate moments, made them feel violated in a way that was difficult to describe. They moved out within a week of Marcus's arrest, then never returned to the house. The house was eventually sold to a company that specialized in properties with unusual histories. The new owners had the crawl space completely sealed and filled with concrete, and they installed additional security measures throughout the house. But the property's value had been permanently damaged by its disturbing history, and it took over a year to find buyers willing to live there. The case became a landmark study in how people with severe mental illness can survive in urban environments by creating hidden living spaces in existing structures. Marcus's story highlighted the failures of the mental health system and the tragic consequences of untreated psychological conditions. It also raised questions about how many other people might be living in similar hidden spaces throughout cities across the country. Kevin and Lisa eventually recovered from their ordeal, but they never forgot the feeling of discovering that their home had been shared with an unwanted occupant for months. Lisa still has nightmares about the pale figure staring at her through the camera. And Kevin can't work in basements without feeling like he's being watched. They now live in a single-story house with no basement, and they had it thoroughly inspected for any possible hidden spaces before moving in. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that our homes may not be as private and secure as we believe. In a world where housing costs forced people to find creative living solutions, and where mental health services are often inadequate, the boundaries between public and private space can become blurred in ways that are both tragic and terrifying. For Kevin and Lisa, the American dream of home ownership became a nightmare when they discovered that the space beneath their feet had been home to someone else long before they arrived. The most haunting aspect of their experience is the knowledge that Marcus had been there all along, watching and listening, a silent witness to their lives, who they never knew existed. It makes you wonder, what might be lurking in the hidden spaces of your own home? And how would you ever know if you weren't alone? Let's move to our seventh story. And this one will make you look at your neighbors differently and question what secrets your entire neighborhood might be hiding. This is the story of David and Jessica Martinez from Millbrook, Connecticut, who thought they had found the perfect suburban community for their young family. What they discovered about their neighbors' weekly gatherings would reveal a conspiracy so disturbing that it would force them to flee in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. David and Jessica Martinez were both successful professionals in their early 30s when they decided to leave their cramped apartment in New York City and move to the suburbs. David worked as a software engineer for a financial firm, while Jessica was a pediatric nurse at a Manhattan hospital. They had a 3-year-old daughter named Emma and were expecting their second child when they began looking for a house in a family-friendly community with good schools and safe neighborhoods. After months of searching, they found what seemed like the perfect place in Millbrook, an affluent suburb about an hour north of the city. The house was a beautiful colonial on Maple Street, with 4 bedrooms, a large backyard, and mature trees that provided privacy and shade. The neighborhood was exactly what they had been looking for. Well-maintained homes, manicured lawns, and the kind of quiet, safe atmosphere where children could play outside without worry. What made the house even more appealing was the neighborhood itself. Maple Street was home to about 20 families, most of whom had lived there for years and had created a close-knit community. The neighbors were friendly and welcoming, organizing block parties, holiday celebrations, and informal gatherings throughout the year. There was a neighborhood watch program, a community garden, and even a private playground that the residents had built together for their children. David and Jessica were immediately embraced by their new neighbors. Within days of moving in, they received invitations to barbecues, offers to help with unpacking, and recommendations for local services and schools. Their next-door neighbors, the Johnsons, were particularly welcoming, offering to babysit Emma and helping Jessica navigate the local healthcare system as her pregnancy progressed. The neighborhood had an almost utopian quality that seemed too good to be true. Crime was virtually non-existent, property values were stable, and the sense of community was stronger than anything David and Jessica had experienced in the city. The neighbors looked out for each other's children, shared resources and tools, and maintained the common areas with pride and dedication. But after living on Maple Street for about 2 months, David and Jessica began to notice some odd patterns in their neighbors' behavior. Every Thursday evening, around 8 o'clock, they would see their neighbors walking toward the community center at the end of the street. The community center was a small building that had been constructed by the residents themselves, supposedly for neighborhood meetings and social gatherings. At first, David and Jessica assumed these were regular homeowners association meetings or social events. But they noticed that the Thursday gatherings were different from the other neighborhood activities. The neighbors who attended these meetings seemed more serious and focused, and they would often stay until very late, sometimes past midnight. When Jessica asked Mrs. Johnson about the Thursday meetings, she was told they were community planning sessions that dealt with neighborhood security and maintenance issues. David and Jessica were never invited to these Thursday meetings, despite being included in all other neighborhood activities. When David mentioned this to his neighbor across the street, Tom Bradley, Tom seemed uncomfortable and said that new residents were usually invited to join the Thursday group after they had been in the neighborhood for at least 6 months. He explained that the meetings dealt with sensitive community issues that required a certain level of trust and commitment. This explanation seemed reasonable, but David and Jessica began to notice other strange things about the Thursday meetings. The neighbors who attended would park their cars several blocks away and walk to the community center as if they didn't want anyone to know they were there. The building would be completely dark from the outside, with heavy curtains covering all the windows. But David could sometimes see faint lights moving inside, as if people were using flashlights or candles. The most disturbing observation came when Jessica was up late one Thursday night with pregnancy insomnia. She was looking out their bedroom window around 11 o'clock when she saw the neighbors leaving the community center. They were walking in complete silence, moving in a single file line, and they all seemed to be carrying small packages or bags. The scene reminded Jessica of some kind of religious procession or ritual, and it made her deeply uncomfortable. Jessica mentioned her observations to David, and they both agreed that there was something unusual about the Thursday meetings. They decided to investigate more carefully, and over the next few weeks, they began paying closer attention to their neighbors' behavior on Thursdays and the days following the meetings. What they discovered was deeply disturbing. On the Fridays following the Thursday meetings, there would often be news reports about crimes or accidents in surrounding communities. Break-ins, vandalism, or sometimes more serious incidents like house fires or car accidents. At first, David and Jessica thought this was just coincidence, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. They also noticed that their neighbors seemed to have detailed knowledge about people and events in other communities that they shouldn't normally know about. During casual conversations, neighbors would mention specific details about families in other towns, about their schedules, their financial situations, and their personal problems. When asked how they knew these things, the neighbors would give vague explanations about community networking or staying informed about regional issues. The breakthrough came when David decided to secretly observe one of the Thursday meetings. He positioned himself in the woods behind the community center, where he could see through a gap in the curtains without being detected. What he saw through that gap would haunt him for the rest of his life. The community center had been transformed into something that looked like a combination of a war room and a cult meeting space. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and detailed charts showing the layouts of houses and neighborhoods throughout the region. The neighbors were seated in a circle, listening to presentations about specific families and properties in other communities. David watched in horror as his neighbors discussed detailed plans for targeting these families. They weren't planning random crimes. They were conducting sophisticated operations designed to force families to move out of desirable properties so that members of their group could purchase the houses at reduced prices. The Thursday meetings were planning sessions for an organized conspiracy to manipulate the real estate market through intimidation, harassment, and carefully orchestrated accidents. The group had been operating for over 15 years, gradually expanding their control over multiple neighborhoods throughout the region. They would identify families in desirable areas, then systematically terrorize them through break-ins, vandalism, and psychological warfare, until the families became desperate to move. The group would then purchase the properties through shell companies at below-market prices, either keeping them as investments or selling them to other group members. David realized that his own family had likely been targeted before they moved to Maple Street. The previous owners of their house had sold quickly and at a price that seemed too good to be true. The Martinez family had been allowed to move in because they fit the group's demographic profile and could potentially be recruited into the conspiracy. The most chilling aspect of what David observed was the level of organization and sophistication involved. The group had members in law enforcement, real estate, insurance, and local government, who helped facilitate their operations and cover up their activities. They had access to personal information, financial records, and even medical records that they used to identify vulnerabilities in their targets. David carefully recorded what he could see and hear, then retreated to his house to share the information with Jessica. They both realized they were in immediate danger. If the group discovered that David had been spying on their meeting, their family would likely become the next target. They also understood that going to the police might not be safe, since some of the group members appeared to be law enforcement officers. Jessica and David made the difficult decision to leave immediately. They packed only essential items and their daughter Emma, telling her they were going on a surprise trip to visit grandparents. They left their house in the middle of the night, driving straight to Jessica's parents' home in another state, where they felt they would be safe while they figured out their next steps. The next morning, David contacted the FBI from his in-laws' house, providing them with the recordings and photographs he had taken of the Thursday meeting. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and led to the arrest of over 30 people across multiple states. The group called themselves the Neighborhood Preservation Society, and they had been operating for nearly 2 decades. They had successfully manipulated real estate markets in dozens of communities, causing hundreds of families to lose their homes and their sense of security. The financial damage was estimated in the tens of millions of dollars, but the psychological damage to their victims was incalculable. The investigation revealed that the group recruited new members carefully, targeting families who fit their socioeconomic profile and who showed signs of being willing to prioritize community loyalty over individual ethics. New residents were observed for months before being approached for membership, and those who were deemed unsuitable or potentially problematic were either driven out or, in some cases, eliminated through more direct means. David and Jessica's case was unique because they had discovered the conspiracy before being fully integrated into the community. Most of the group's victims never realized they were being targeted by an organized conspiracy. They simply experienced a series of increasingly frightening incidents that eventually drove them to move away from the area. The legal proceedings against the Neighborhood Preservation Society were complex and lengthy. Many of the group's activities fell into gray areas of the law, and proving conspiracy charges required extensive documentation and testimony from victims who had scattered across the country. Several group members received significant prison sentences, but others were able to plea bargain for reduced charges in exchange for cooperation with the investigation. David and Jessica never returned to their house on Maple Street. The property was eventually sold as part of the legal settlement, with the proceeds going to compensate victims of the conspiracy. The entire Maple Street neighborhood was disbanded, with most of the remaining residents moving away as news of the conspiracy became public. Today, David and Jessica live in a different state under assumed names, still fearful that former members of the Neighborhood Preservation Society might seek revenge for their role in exposing the conspiracy. They have difficulty trusting neighbors and avoid getting involved in community activities, knowing that the friendly faces next door might be hiding the darkest of intentions. Their story serves as a terrifying reminder that evil can hide behind the most wholesome facades, and that the American dream of suburban community life can be corrupted by greed and manipulation. For David and Jessica, the perfect neighborhood became a nightmare when they discovered that their neighbors' weekly gatherings weren't about building community. They were about destroying other families' lives for profit. The most chilling aspect of their experience is the knowledge that similar conspiracies might be operating in neighborhoods across the country, hidden behind barbecues and block parties, using the bonds of community to mask sophisticated criminal enterprises. it makes you wonder, what are your neighbors really doing at those weekly meetings? And how well do you really know the people living next door? Let's move to our 8th story. And this one will make you question every sound you hear in your house at night, especially if you live in an older home. This is the story of Robert and Catherine Walsh from Salem, Massachusetts, who thought the nightly sounds in their 1920s Victorian were just the house settling. What they discovered about the recurring argument they heard every night at exactly 3:17 a.m. would reveal a tragedy from decades past that refused to stay buried. Robert and Catherine Walsh were both history professors at a local college when they decided to buy their first home together. They had been married for 5 years and were looking for a house with character and historical significance that would reflect their shared passion for the past. After months of searching, they found the perfect property. A stunning 1920s Victorian mansion in Salem's historic district that had been meticulously maintained and was being sold by the estate of its recently deceased owner. The house was everything they had dreamed of. 3 stories of architectural beauty with original hardwood floors, ornate moldings, stained glass windows, and period fixtures that had been lovingly preserved. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Evelyn Blackwood, had lived in the house for over 60 years and had maintained it as a showcase of 1920s elegance. When Evelyn passed away at age 89, her estate put the house on the market, and Robert and Catherine were thrilled to be able to purchase such a magnificent piece of history. The house came with extensive documentation of its past. Original blueprints, photographs from different decades, and even some personal items that Evelyn had left behind, including journals and letters that detailed life in the house over the years. Robert and Catherine were fascinated by this historical treasure trove and spent their first few weeks in the house reading through the documents and learning about the families who had lived there before them. The house had been built in 1923 by a wealthy businessman named Theodore Ashford and his wife Margaret. The Ashfords had lived in the house for over 30 years, raising 3 children and hosting elaborate social gatherings that were legendary in Salem society. The house had been the center of the community's social life during the 1920s and 1930s, with parties and events that attracted prominent figures from across New England. But Robert and Catherine soon learned that the house's history wasn't entirely pleasant. According to the documents they found, Theodore and Margaret Ashford's marriage had deteriorated significantly during the 1940s. Theodore had developed a drinking problem and had become increasingly violent and controlling. The couple's arguments had become so frequent and intense that neighbors had complained to the police on multiple occasions. The Ashford story came to an end in 1951 when both Theodore and Margaret passed away within days of each other. The sudden loss shocked the Salem community and left the house empty for several years before it was eventually sold to Evelyn Blackwood's family in 1955. Robert and Catherine found this history fascinating rather than disturbing. As historians, they were accustomed to dealing with the darker aspects of the past, and they felt honored to be living in a house with such a rich and complex history. They even planned to write a book about the house and its previous occupants, using the extensive documentation they had discovered. But about 3 weeks after moving in, Robert and Catherine began experiencing something that made them reconsider their academic detachment from the house's tragic past. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., they would be awakened by the sound of voices coming from somewhere in the house. At first, the voices were faint and indistinct, and they assumed the sounds were coming from outside. Perhaps late-night pedestrians or neighbors having conversations. However, the voices became clearer and more distinct over time. and Robert and Catherine realized they were hearing what sounded like an argument between a man and a woman. The argument always followed the same pattern. It would begin with raised voices, escalate to shouting, and then end abruptly with what sounded like a struggle, followed by complete silence. The entire episode would last exactly 12 minutes. From 3:17 to 3:29 a.m., Catherine was the first to recognize the significance of the timing. According to the police reports she had found in Evelyn's documents, Theodore Ashford had killed his wife at approximately 3:20 a.m. on March 15, 1951. The nightly arguments they were hearing seemed to be occurring at the exact time when the original tragedy had taken place over 70 years earlier. Robert was initially skeptical, suggesting that Catherine was letting her knowledge of the house's history influence her interpretation of what were probably just normal house sounds or noises from the neighborhood. But as the nightly arguments continued, he began to hear them more clearly, and he couldn't deny that they sounded like actual human voices engaged in a heated dispute. The breakthrough came when Robert decided to record the nightly sounds to analyze them more objectively. He set up a digital recorder in their bedroom and captured several nights' worth of audio. When he played back the recordings, what he heard was both fascinating and terrifying. The recordings clearly captured the voices of a man and woman arguing, and while the words weren't always distinct, certain phrases came through clearly. The man's voice was angry and accusatory, making statements like, "You're destroying this family," and "I won't let you leave me." The woman's voice was defensive and frightened, pleading with the man to please stop and think about the children. Most chilling of all, the arguments seemed to be the same conversation repeated night after night, as if Robert and Catherine were hearing a recording of the actual argument that had led to Margaret Ashford's death. The voices, the timing, and even the progression of the argument matched the details described in the police reports from 1951. Robert and Catherine began researching the phenomenon they were experiencing, and they discovered that their house was exhibiting what paranormal investigators call residual haunting, a type of supernatural activity where traumatic events from the past replay themselves like a recording, usually at the same time and in the same location where the original events occurred. The couple decided to investigate further by researching the exact details of the Ashfords' final argument. They found additional police reports and witness statements that provided more specific information about what had happened on the night of the murder. According to neighbors who had heard the argument, Theodore had accused Margaret of having an affair and had threatened to kill her if she tried to leave him. Margaret had been planning to take their children and move to her sister's house in Boston, and Theodore had discovered her plans. The argument began at 3:15 a.m. when Theodore confronted Margaret about leaving. They argued before moving upstairs, where both died tragically. This occurred between 3:17 and 3:29 a.m., matching the timing Robert and Catherine experienced. Armed with this information, Robert and Catherine began paying closer attention to the sounds they heard each night. They realized that the argument seemed to move through the house, starting in the living room and then progressing upstairs to what had been the Ashfords' bedroom, the same room where Robert and Catherine now slept. The most disturbing aspect of their experience was that the nightly arguments seemed to be getting more intense and realistic over time. What had started as faint voices had become clear, distinct conversations, and Robert and Catherine began to feel as if they were actually witnessing the events of that tragic night in 1951. The situation reached a crisis point when Catherine began experiencing what she described as waking dreams during the nightly arguments. She would find herself standing in their bedroom, watching as the ghostly figures of Theodore and Margaret Ashford reenacted their final, fatal confrontation. Catherine could see Margaret's terrified face as Theodore's hands closed around her throat, and she could hear Margaret's desperate pleas for mercy that had gone unanswered over 70 years ago. Robert was initially concerned that Catherine was having some kind of psychological breakdown. But when he began experiencing similar visions, he realized that something supernatural was definitely occurring in their house. The nightly arguments weren't just auditory phenomena. They were complete reenactments of the murder that had taken place in their bedroom decades earlier. The couple consulted with paranormal investigators and learned that their house was experiencing an extremely rare and intense form of residual haunting. The traumatic emotions and violent energy from the Ashfords' final argument had somehow imprinted themselves on the house itself, creating a supernatural recording that played back every night at the anniversary of the original events. The investigators explained that residual hauntings typically fade over time, but the Ashford haunting had been unusually persistent, possibly because the emotions involved had been so intense and the violence so sudden and brutal. The fact that Robert and Catherine were now sleeping in the same room where the murder had occurred seemed to be amplifying the phenomenon and making them more sensitive to the supernatural replay. The paranormal team recommended that Robert and Catherine either move to a different bedroom in the house or consider having the house professionally cleansed by a spiritual advisor. However, they warned that residual hauntings were notoriously difficult to eliminate, especially when they had been active for as long as the Ashford haunting had been. Robert and Catherine tried moving to a different bedroom, but the nightly arguments continued, and they found that they could hear them clearly throughout the house. The sounds seemed to follow them wherever they went, as if the house itself was determined to make them witness the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. The final straw came when Catherine began experiencing physical symptoms during the nightly arguments. She would wake up with bruises on her neck and arms that seemed to match the injuries that Margaret Ashford had sustained during her murder. Robert would find Catherine in a trance-like state, reliving Margaret's final moments and experiencing the terror and pain that the murdered woman had felt over 70 years ago. Fearing for Catherine's safety and sanity, Robert and Catherine made the difficult decision to leave the house. They had invested their life savings in the property and had planned to spend years researching and writing about its history. But they realized that some aspects of the past were too dangerous to explore. The couple moved out within a month of the physical manifestations beginning, and they never returned to the house. They sold the property to a paranormal research organization that specialized in studying residual hauntings, and the house is now used as a research facility for investigating supernatural phenomena. Robert and Catherine eventually recovered from their ordeal, but they never forgot the experience of witnessing a murder from the past replaying itself night after night in their bedroom. Catherine still has nightmares about Margaret Ashford's final moments, and Robert continues to wake up at 3:17 a.m., even though they no longer live in the house where the nightly arguments occurred. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that some houses hold on to their past in ways that can be both fascinating and terrifying. The beautiful Victorian mansion, that had seemed like a historian's dream, had become a nightmare when the past refused to stay buried. For Robert and Catherine, the house's rich history had become a curse that followed them into their dreams and threatened to consume their lives. The most haunting aspect of their experience is the knowledge that Margaret Ashford's final moments continue to replay themselves every night at 3:17 a.m., a supernatural recording of terror and violence that refuses to fade with time. The house remembers what happened within its walls, and it seems determined to make sure that Margaret's story is never forgotten, even if it means traumatizing the living residents who dare to sleep in the room where she died. Today, the house stands as a monument to the power of traumatic memory and the ways that violent emotions can imprint themselves on physical spaces. For Robert and Catherine, it was a reminder that some historical research comes with a price that's too high to pay, and that the past sometimes refuses to remain safely in the past. Let's move to our ninth story. And this one will make you think twice about every real estate transaction and question whether the person selling you your dream home is who they claim to be. This is the story of Brandon and Nicole Foster from Tampa, Florida, who thought they had found the perfect realtor to help them buy their first home. What they discovered about their helpful agent would reveal a deception so elaborate that it had been going on for years, targeting unsuspecting families with deadly consequences. Brandon and Nicole Foster were both in their late 20s when they decided to take the plunge into homeownership. Brandon worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, while Nicole was a graphic designer who had recently started her own freelance business. They had been renting a small apartment for 3 years while saving for a down payment, and they were finally ready to buy their first house together. The couple began their house hunting journey by researching real estate agents online, looking for someone with good reviews and extensive knowledge of the Tampa area. They found what seemed like the perfect agent, Patricia Henley, a 52-year-old woman who had been selling real estate in the Tampa Bay area for over 15 years. Patricia's website showcased dozens of satisfied clients, impressive sales numbers, and glowing testimonials from families who praised her dedication and expertise. Patricia contacted Brandon and Nicole within hours of their initial inquiry, and she immediately impressed them with her professionalism and knowledge. She seemed to understand exactly what they were looking for: a starter home in a safe neighborhood with good schools and potential for appreciation. Patricia scheduled several showings for the following weekend and promised to find them the perfect house within their budget. From their first meeting, Patricia seemed almost too good to be true. She was incredibly knowledgeable about every property they visited, providing detailed information about the neighborhoods, the previous owners, and even the specific features and potential problems of each house. She seemed to have insider knowledge about properties that weren't even officially on the market yet, and she was able to arrange private showings and negotiate favorable terms that other agents couldn't match. What impressed Brandon and Nicole most was Patricia's personal attention and genuine concern for their welfare. She would call them regularly to check on their progress, offer advice about mortgage options and home inspections, and even recommend contractors and service providers for future home improvements. She seemed more like a family friend than a business associate, and they felt incredibly lucky to have found such a dedicated professional. After looking at dozens of properties over several weeks, Patricia showed them a house that seemed absolutely perfect. It was a beautiful 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet suburban neighborhood, with updated appliances, a large backyard, and a price that was surprisingly affordable for the area. The house had been on the market for only a few days, and Patricia urged them to make an offer quickly before other buyers discovered it. The previous owners, Patricia explained, were an elderly couple named the Hendersons, who had lived in the house for over 20 years before deciding to move to a retirement community in Arizona. They were motivated sellers who wanted to close quickly, and they were willing to accept an offer below asking price if Brandon and Nicole could move fast. Patricia handled all the negotiations and paperwork, making the entire process remarkably smooth and stress-free. Brandon and Nicole were thrilled with their new home and grateful to Patricia for helping them find such a perfect property. They moved in during the summer and spent their first few months painting, decorating, and settling into their new neighborhood. Patricia continued to check on them regularly, offering advice about local services and even bringing them housewarming gifts. But about 3 months after moving in, Brandon began noticing some odd things about their house and their real estate transaction. While organizing their closing documents, he realized that some of the paperwork seemed inconsistent. The property deed showed a different previous owner than the Hendersons that Patricia had mentioned, and the sales history didn't match what Patricia had told them about the house being on the market for only a few days. Brandon decided to do some research at the county records office, and what he discovered was deeply disturbing. The house had actually been owned by a family named the Carlsons, not the Hendersons. The Carlsons had lived in the house for 12 years before they had mysteriously disappeared 6 months earlier. Their disappearance had been investigated by the police, but no trace of the family had ever been found. Even more disturbing, Brandon discovered that Patricia Henley didn't exist in any official real estate licensing records. There was no agent by that name registered with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, and the real estate company she claimed to work for had no record of employing anyone named Patricia Henley. Brandon immediately shared this information with Nicole, and they both realized they had been the victims of an elaborate fraud. But the implications were far more serious than just a real estate scam. If the previous owners had disappeared and Patricia wasn't a real estate agent, how had she been able to sell them the house? And what had happened to the Carlson family? The couple contacted the police, and the investigation that followed revealed a horrifying truth about Patricia Henley and the house they had purchased. Patricia's real name was Margaret Voss, and she was a 48-year-old woman with a long history of identity theft, fraud, and suspected involvement in multiple disappearances across several states. Margaret had been operating her real estate scam for over 8 years, targeting young couples who were first-time homebuyers. Her method was sophisticated and deadly. She would identify families who lived in desirable properties, then systematically stalk and study them for months, learning their routines, their financial situations, and their personal relationships. When Margaret was ready to strike, she would eliminate the families through methods that made their disappearances look like voluntary relocations. She had connections with criminals who specialized in making people disappear without a trace, and she would arrange for entire families to be kidnapped and murdered while making it appear that they had simply moved away. Margaret would then assume control of the victims' properties through forged documents and false identities. She would create fake real estate listings and pose as a legitimate agent to sell the houses to unsuspecting buyers like Brandon and Nicole. The buyers would unknowingly purchase homes where entire families had been murdered, and Margaret would pocket the proceeds from the sales. The investigation revealed that Margaret had been responsible for at least 12 family disappearances over the past 8 years, and she had sold their homes to dozens of innocent buyers who had no idea they were living in houses where murders had taken place. The Carlson family, Robert, Linda, and their 2 young children, had been Margaret's most recent victims. The police found evidence that the Carlsons had been murdered in their own home before their bodies were disposed of in a remote location that investigators were still trying to identify. Margaret had spent weeks cleaning the house and removing all traces of the family's presence before putting it on the market and selling it to Brandon and Nicole. Brandon and Nicole were devastated by the revelation that they had been living in a house where an entire family had been murdered. The knowledge that they had been sleeping in bedrooms where children had been killed, cooking in a kitchen where parents had been murdered, and living their daily lives in a space that had been the scene of such horrific violence was psychologically traumatic. The couple also realized that they had been in extreme danger throughout their relationship with Margaret. As first-time homebuyers who fit her target demographic, they could easily have become her next victims if they had discovered her deception while she was still operating freely. Margaret had been studying their routines and personal lives for months, and she had all the information she would have needed to make them disappear just like the Carlsons. The legal situation was incredibly complex. Brandon and Nicole had purchased the house in good faith, but the sale had been conducted through fraudulent means by someone who had no legal right to sell the property. The house technically still belonged to the Carlson family estate, but since the family was dead and their bodies hadn't been found, the legal ownership was in limbo. Margaret was eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, fraud, and identity theft across several states. The investigation into her activities led to the discovery of additional victims and revealed a criminal network that had been operating for over a decade. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but the families she had destroyed could never be brought back. Brandon and Nicole were forced to move out of the house while the legal issues were resolved. They lost their down payment and the money they had spent on improvements, and they struggled with severe psychological trauma from learning about the murders that had taken place in their home. The house was eventually demolished after the Carlson family's bodies were finally found and the property was released to their surviving relatives. The case became a landmark study in real estate fraud and highlighted the vulnerabilities in the home buying process that criminals can exploit. New regulations were implemented requiring additional verification of real estate agents' credentials and property ownership. But experts acknowledged that determined criminals could still find ways to exploit the system. Brandon and Nicole eventually recovered financially and emotionally, but they never forgot the experience of unknowingly living in a house where an entire family had been murdered. They now live in a different state and work as advocates for stronger consumer protections in real estate transactions. Nicole still has nightmares about the Carlson children, and Brandon struggles with guilt about the fact that their dream home had been built on the tragedy of another family's destruction. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that the people we trust with our most important life decisions, buying a home, starting a family, building a future, might not be who they claim to be. Margaret Voss had perfected the art of appearing trustworthy and professional while orchestrating some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. The most terrifying aspect of Brandon and Nicole's experience is the realization that they had been living in a crime scene for months without knowing it, sleeping in beds where children had been murdered and eating meals in a kitchen where parents had been killed. Their dream home had been a nightmare from the moment they signed the papers, and they had been completely unaware of the horror that surrounded them. For Brandon and Nicole, the lesson was clear. In a world where criminals can assume any identity and exploit any system, even the most basic transactions require vigilance and verification. The friendly real estate agent who seems too good to be true might be exactly that. And the perfect house at the perfect price might come with a history that's too terrible to imagine. Today, the lot where the Carlson family's house once stood remains empty, a silent memorial to the victims of Margaret Voss's crimes. Brandon and Nicole drive by it sometimes when they visit Tampa, remembering the family they never knew, but whose tragedy became intertwined with their own lives in the most horrific way possible. It serves as a reminder that evil can hide behind the most professional facades, and that sometimes the American dream can become a nightmare built on other people's suffering. Let's move to our 10th story, and this one will make you question every unexplained sound you hear in your house and wonder if you're truly alone when you think you are. This is the story of Tyler and Hannah Rodriguez from Boise, Idaho, who thought the strange occurrences in their new home were just typical moving-in adjustments. What they discovered about the supernatural presence sharing their house would escalate from harmless pranks to a terrifying battle for their very lives. Tyler and Hannah Rodriguez were both in their early 30s when they decided to leave their busy city life in Seattle and move to Boise for a fresh start. Tyler had landed a promotion with his tech company that allowed him to work remotely, while Hannah was excited to pursue her dream of opening a small bakery in a more affordable market. They had been married for 6 years and were ready to settle down in a place where they could build the life they had always envisioned together. After weeks of online searching, they found what appeared to be the perfect house. A charming 1960s ranch-style home in a quiet residential neighborhood. The house had been recently renovated with modern amenities while maintaining its original character, featuring hardwood floors, large windows, and a spacious kitchen that would be perfect for Hannah to practice her baking recipes. The previous owner, an elderly man named Walter Grimsby, had lived there for over 40 years before passing away peacefully in his sleep. The house was being sold by Walter's nephew, who lived out of state and wanted to settle the estate quickly. The price was remarkably reasonable for the area, and the nephew explained that Walter had been meticulous about maintenance and had updated most of the major systems in recent years. Tyler and Hannah felt incredibly fortunate to find such a well-maintained property at such an affordable price. The first few weeks in their new home were everything Tyler and Hannah had hoped for. They spent their days unpacking, arranging furniture, and exploring their new neighborhood. Hannah set up a small baking station in the kitchen and began experimenting with recipes for her future bakery, while Tyler created a home office in the spare bedroom where he could work remotely. But about a month after moving in, they began experiencing small, unexplained incidents that seemed like harmless pranks at first. Items would be moved from where they had left them. Hannah would find her measuring cups in different cabinets, or Tyler would discover his coffee mug in the refrigerator instead of the dishwasher where he had placed it. Initially, they blamed each other for the misplaced items, laughing about the stress of moving affecting their memories. The incidents became more frequent and more noticeable over time. Books would be rearranged on shelves, pictures would be turned slightly askew, and lights would be turned on or off in rooms they hadn't entered. Hannah began finding her baking ingredients mixed together in strange combinations. Sugar mixed with salt, flour scattered across counters, and recipe cards torn and rearranged in nonsensical orders. Tyler was initially skeptical, suggesting that they were both under stress from the move and their new routines, and that they were probably causing these incidents themselves without realizing it. But when he started finding his work papers reorganized and his computer files moved into different folders, he began to take the situation more seriously. The first truly frightening incident occurred on a Tuesday evening when Hannah was baking in the kitchen while Tyler worked in his office. Hannah heard Tyler call her name from upstairs, asking her to come help him with something. She turned off the oven and went upstairs. But when she reached Tyler's office, she found him deeply focused on his work with headphones on. When she asked what he needed help with, Tyler looked confused and said he hadn't called her name. Hannah returned to the kitchen to find that someone had turned the oven back on and had arranged her baking tools in a perfect circle on the counter. The flour she had been using was scattered across the floor in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, and her recipe book was open to a page she had never seen before. A handwritten recipe for something called Walter's Favorite Cookies that wasn't part of the original cookbook. This incident marked a turning point in the supernatural activity. The presence in their house seemed to become more bold and interactive, as if it had been testing them and was now ready to make itself known more directly. Tyler and Hannah began hearing footsteps in empty rooms. Doors would open and close on their own. and they would occasionally catch glimpses of a shadowy figure moving through their peripheral vision. The entity seemed particularly drawn to Hannah's baking activities. Whenever she worked in the kitchen, ingredients would be mysteriously added to her recipes, oven temperatures would be adjusted without her knowledge, and finished baked goods would disappear overnight. At first, Hannah thought Tyler was eating her experiments, but she soon realized that entire batches of cookies and cakes were vanishing completely, leaving no crumbs or evidence behind. The breakthrough came when Hannah decided to research the history of their house more thoroughly. She contacted Walter's nephew and asked about Walter's life and interests. What she learned explained everything they had been experiencing and revealed the identity of their supernatural housemate. Walter Grimsby had been a passionate baker who had spent decades perfecting recipes and creating elaborate cakes and pastries for his friends and neighbors. After his wife died 20 years earlier, baking had become Walter's primary source of joy and his way of connecting with the community. He had been known throughout the neighborhood for his incredible cookies, which he would bake fresh every Tuesday and distribute to anyone who stopped by his house. Walter had died on a Tuesday evening while preparing his weekly batch of cookies. He had suffered a heart attack in the kitchen, and his body had been found the next morning surrounded by the ingredients for his famous recipe. The nephew revealed that Walter had been obsessed with perfecting his cookie recipe and had spent the last years of his life trying to create the perfect combination of ingredients. Armed with this information, Hannah realized that Walter's spirit was still in the house, continuing his baking routine and trying to share his passion with the new occupants. The supernatural activity wasn't malicious. It was Walter's way of trying to teach Hannah his recipes and continue the baking tradition that had defined his later years. Hannah decided to try communicating with Walter's spirit directly. She spoke aloud in the kitchen, acknowledging his presence and asking him to help her understand what he wanted to share. The response was immediate and dramatic. Ingredients began moving on their own. Measuring cups filled themselves with precise amounts, and the oven turned on to exactly the right temperature. Over the next several weeks, Hannah learned to bake alongside Walter's spirit. She would start a recipe, and Walter would guide her through his modifications and improvements, moving ingredients and adjusting measurements to create the perfect results. The collaboration was initially exciting and touching. Hannah felt honored to be learning from a master baker who was sharing decades of knowledge and passion. But the supernatural collaboration gradually became more intense and demanding. Walter's spirit seemed to expect Hannah to bake constantly, and he would become agitated when she tried to pursue other activities. Ingredients would be thrown around the kitchen when Hannah didn't follow his instructions exactly, and the oven would turn on at all hours of the night, as if Walter was trying to bake even when Hannah was sleeping. The situation escalated when Walter's spirit began trying to take control of Hannah's body while she was baking. Hannah would find herself moving involuntarily, her hands guided by an invisible force that would measure ingredients and mix batters with supernatural precision. At first, these episodes lasted only a few minutes, but they gradually became longer and more intense. Tyler became increasingly concerned as he watched Hannah's personality change during these supernatural baking sessions. She would speak in a different voice, using old-fashioned expressions and referring to people and places from Walter's past. Her baking skills improved dramatically, but she seemed to lose pieces of herself with each supernatural collaboration. The crisis came when Hannah began baking compulsively, spending entire days in the kitchen creating elaborate cakes and pastries that she would then leave untouched. Walter's spirit seemed to be using Hannah's body to continue his baking routine, and Hannah was losing the ability to control her own actions. She would wake up in the morning to find that she had been baking all night, with no memory of the activities. Tyler realized that Walter's spirit was becoming possessive of Hannah and was trying to make her a permanent vessel for his continued existence. The harmless collaboration had become a supernatural possession that was threatening Hannah's identity and autonomy. Tyler researched methods for dealing with possessive spirits and learned that they needed to help Walter find peace and move on from his earthly attachments. The solution came when Tyler and Hannah discovered Walter's original recipe book, hidden in a kitchen cabinet they had never opened. The book contained hundreds of recipes that Walter had perfected over the decades, along with personal notes about the people he had baked for and the joy that baking had brought to his life. The final entry in the book was a note Walter had written just before his death, expressing his fear that his recipes and his passion for baking would be forgotten after he was gone. Hannah realized that Walter's spirit was clinging to the house because he was afraid his legacy would disappear. She decided to honor Walter's memory by preserving his recipes and sharing them with the community, just as he had done during his lifetime. She spent several days copying all of Walter's recipes and creating a cookbook that she planned to distribute to neighbors and local bakeries. When Hannah finished the cookbook, she held a ceremony in the kitchen where she thanked Walter for sharing his knowledge and promised that his recipes would continue to bring joy to people for generations to come. She placed the original recipe book in a place of honor and lit a candle in Walter's memory. The supernatural activity stopped immediately after the ceremony. The possessive episodes ended, the mysterious ingredient movements ceased, and the house felt peaceful for the first time since Tyler and Hannah had moved in. Walter's spirit seemed to have found the peace he needed to move on, knowing that his passion for baking would be remembered and continued. Hannah went on to open her bakery using many of Walter's recipes, and the business became incredibly successful. She named the bakery Walter's Legacy and always kept a photo of the original owner behind the counter. Customers often commented on the exceptional quality of the baked goods, and Hannah would tell them about the master baker who had taught her his secrets from beyond the grave. Tyler and Hannah continued to live in the house, but their relationship with it was forever changed by their supernatural experience. They had learned that some spirits don't haunt houses out of malice, but out of love and a desire to share their passions with the living. Walter's spirit had been trying to find someone who would appreciate and continue his life's work, and Hannah had been the perfect student for his otherworldly lessons. Their story serves as a reminder that not all supernatural encounters are frightening or malevolent. Sometimes, the spirits that share our homes are simply trying to pass on their knowledge and ensure that their legacies live on. For Tyler and Hannah, their haunted house became a bridge between the past and the present, allowing them to learn from someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting his craft. The most touching aspect of their experience is the realization that Walter's spirit had been waiting for years for someone who would appreciate his passion for baking. Hannah's arrival had given him the opportunity to share his knowledge one final time before finding the peace he needed to move on. Their supernatural collaboration had created something beautiful, a successful bakery that continues to bring joy to the community, just as Walter had always hoped his baking would do. Today, Walter's Legacy Bakery is one of the most popular businesses in Boise, and Hannah often feels Walter's presence when she's creating his recipes. She knows that his spirit has moved on, but his passion for baking lives on through her work and through the countless people who enjoy the recipes he spent a lifetime perfecting. For Tyler and Hannah, their haunted house had become a blessing in disguise, connecting them to a kindred spirit who had shared his greatest gift with them from beyond the grave. Let's move to our 11th and final story. And this one will make you question whether you can ever truly escape a house that refuses to let you go. This is the story of Marcus and Elena Thompson from Portland, Oregon, who thought they had successfully escaped their nightmare home and started fresh in a new city. What they discovered about their supernatural stalker would prove that some hauntings aren't tied to places. They're tied to people, and they follow you wherever you go. Marcus and Elena Thompson had endured 18 months of pure hell in their previous home in Sacramento, California. Their beautiful Victorian house had been plagued by supernatural activity that had escalated from minor disturbances to violent attacks that had left them both physically and emotionally scarred. Doors would slam shut on their own. Objects would fly across rooms, and they would wake up to find threatening messages scratched into their bedroom walls. The activity had centered around Eleni, who seemed to be the primary target of whatever malevolent force had taken residence in their home. She would be pushed downstairs, locked in rooms, and subjected to terrifying visions that left her screaming in the middle of the night. Marcus had tried everything: priests, paranormal investigators, even having the house blessed by multiple religious leaders. But nothing had worked. The entity seemed to grow stronger and more violent with each attempt to remove it. Finally, after Elena was hospitalized following a particularly brutal supernatural attack that left her with broken ribs and deep scratches across her back, Marcus made the decision to abandon their home completely. They packed only essential belongings and moved across the country to Portland, hoping that distance would break whatever connection the entity had formed with Elena. For the first few weeks in their new apartment, Marcus and Elena felt a sense of relief they hadn't experienced in over a year. The supernatural activity had stopped completely, and Elena began to recover both physically and emotionally from her ordeal. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a modern complex, deliberately choosing a newly constructed building with no history that could harbor supernatural presences. Marcus returned to work as a software developer, while Elena slowly began rebuilding her confidence and looking for employment as a graphic designer. They avoided talking about their experiences in Sacramento, trying to put the nightmare behind them and focus on building a normal life together. For 3 blissful months, it seemed like their strategy had worked. But on a Tuesday evening in October, the supernatural activity returned with a vengeance. Elena was alone in the apartment when she heard the familiar sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside their door. The footsteps would pace back and forth for hours, always stopping directly in front of their apartment. When Elena looked through the peephole, the hallway was always empty, but she could still hear the footsteps continuing their relentless march. The activity quickly escalated to the same level of violence they had experienced in Sacramento. Objects began flying across their apartment. Elena would wake up with new scratches and bruises, and the threatening messages returned. This time carved into their bathroom mirror and scratched into their bedroom door. The entity had somehow followed them across the country and had resumed its torment with renewed intensity. Marcus was devastated by the realization that their escape had failed. He had hoped that leaving their haunted house would end their nightmare, but it was becoming clear that the entity wasn't attached to their previous home. It was attached to Elena herself. Whatever had been tormenting them in Sacramento had followed them to Portland and was now making their new apartment just as uninhabitable as their previous house had been. The couple consulted with paranormal experts who specialized in attachment hauntings, cases where supernatural entities form connections with specific individuals rather than locations. They learned that Elena had somehow become the target of what investigators called a parasitic entity, a malevolent spirit that feeds off fear and negative energy and that can follow its victims anywhere they go. The experts explained that parasitic entities are among the most dangerous types of supernatural phenomena because they can't be escaped through relocation. The entity had formed a psychic connection with Elena during their time in Sacramento, and that connection allowed it to follow her regardless of physical distance. The only way to break the attachment was through a complex spiritual cleansing process that would require Elena to confront the entity directly and sever the psychic bond it had formed with her. The cleansing process was terrifying and dangerous. Elena had to allow the entity to manifest fully while she remained conscious and aware, resisting its attempts to possess her completely, while a team of spiritual advisors worked to break the psychic connection. The process took place over 3 days, during which Elena experienced the most intense supernatural attacks of her entire ordeal. On the final day of the cleansing, the entity made one last desperate attempt to maintain its hold on Elena. It manifested as a dark, humanoid figure that filled their apartment with an overwhelming sense of malevolence and despair. Elena could feel the entity trying to merge with her consciousness, attempting to make the attachment permanent by taking complete control of her mind and body. But Elena had learned to fight back during the months of torment. With the support of Marcus and the spiritual advisors, she was able to resist the entity's final assault and assert her own will over the psychic connection. She demanded that the entity leave her alone and return to whatever realm it had come from, using her own spiritual strength to sever the bond that had allowed it to follow her. The cleansing was successful, but the process left Elena physically and emotionally drained. She had confronted the darkest aspects of supernatural evil and had emerged victorious, but the experience had changed her permanently. She had developed psychic abilities that allowed her to sense supernatural presences, and she could no longer live in ignorance of the spiritual world that exists alongside our physical reality. Marcus and Elena remained in Portland, but their lives were forever altered by their experience with the parasitic entity. Elena used her newfound psychic abilities to help other people who were dealing with supernatural attachments, working with paranormal investigators to identify and break the connections between malevolent entities and their human victims. The couple learned that their ordeal had been part of a larger pattern of supernatural activity that had been affecting people across the country. The entity that had attached itself to Elena was one of many parasitic spirits that had been growing stronger and more aggressive in recent years, possibly due to increased stress and negative energy in modern society. Elena's case became a landmark study in attachment hauntings and helped paranormal researchers develop better methods for identifying and treating people who had become targets of parasitic entities. Her experience proved that supernatural phenomena aren't always tied to specific locations, and that some spirits are capable of forming connections with individuals that transcend physical boundaries. Today, Marcus and Elena live quietly in Portland, but they remain vigilant about supernatural activity and continue to help others who are dealing with similar experiences. Elena has written a book about her ordeal and travels around the country speaking to people who are struggling with supernatural attachments. She has learned that knowledge and preparation are the best defenses against malevolent entities, and that victims of supernatural harassment are never truly alone in their struggles. Their story serves as both a warning and a source of hope for people who are dealing with supernatural phenomena. It demonstrates that some hauntings can't be escaped through relocation, but it also proves that even the most powerful malevolent entities can be defeated through courage, determination, and the right kind of spiritual intervention. The most important lesson from Marcus and Elena's experience is that supernatural attachments are real and dangerous, but they are not permanent. With the right help and the right approach, Even the most persistent parasitic entities can be banished, and their victims can reclaim their lives and their freedom. For Marcus and Elena, their nightmare had a happy ending, but only because they were willing to fight for it and never gave up hope that they could break free from the entity that had tried to destroy them. If you've made it through all 11 of these terrifying true stories, you're probably looking around your own home right now with new eyes, wondering what secrets might be hidden in your walls or what previous tragedies might have occurred within your rooms. That's exactly what I want you to do, because awareness is your first line of defense against the horrors that can lurk in any home. Here at Verified Fears, we don't just tell these stories to scare you, we share them to prepare you. Every single one of these families thought they were safe, thought they had done their research, thought they knew what they were getting into. But the truth is, you can never fully know the history of a house or the intentions of the people around you until it's too late. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong in your home, don't dismiss it as imagination or stress. Investigate every strange sound, every missing item, every helpful neighbor who seems to know too much about your life. Document everything with photos, videos, and written records. Research your home's history thoroughly, and don't just rely on what real estate agents or previous owners tell you. Most importantly, remember that you have the power to protect yourself and your family. Whether you're dealing with human predators hiding in your basement, neighbors with sinister agendas, or supernatural entities that refuse to move on, you don't have to face these horrors alone. There are professionals who can help, authorities who will listen, and communities of people who have survived similar experiences. Subscribe to Verified Fears if you want to stay informed about the real dangers that can threaten your home and your family. Hit that notification bell because the stories we share here could save your life someday. And remember, in a world where horror can hide behind any friendly face or lurk in any dark corner, the most important thing you can do is stay alert, stay informed, and never ignore the warning signs that something in your home isn't right. Sweet dreams, and remember to check your locks tonight. You never know who or what might be trying to get in.